Everyone, welcome back. Today I wanted to just give you some overview information on The Sun Also Rises and read through a couple of quotes that I would like you to consider that really highlight some of the contextual themes of the novel. One of the ideas I want to just introduce to you is the Hemingway hero. Hemingway redefines what a hero is within the modern world, and this is something that he's kind of building upon from other artists that are out there that we've studied, examining what does it mean to be in this modern urban environment. And so as he takes a look at this hero, I want you to think about some of these values that you see within Jake Barnes, right? And he said, a Hemingway hero is someone that has great dignity, some type of inner strength or poise, someone that experiences difficulties, but does so with restraint, right? Someone that also has some type of self-discipline, that they might not be able to control their environment, right? We see the modern world seemingly as though it's destroying aspects of the human condition, right? Whether it's the fight for survival, right? The survival of the fittest, or fighting for resources. There's this constant conflict that the modern man, or modern humanity, I should say, faces. The Hemingway hero is going to have some type of self-discipline. You can't control your outside world, but you can control yourself within it. Generally, they're going to have some type of know-how, whether that's going to be some type of skill, right? A boxer, a bullfighter, a doctor, some type of hunter, writer, right? Something that helps them, that they can kind of cling to, that helps them to be able to get through these difficult circumstances. Generally, a Hemingway hero is going to cling to truth. In a world that seems as though it's in ashes, the only thing that you really can turn to, that you can rely on, is truth, right? That's the only thing that's going to be continuous. And generally, they find comfort in friends, in sports, and nature. And these elements give people that are experiencing trauma and difficulties some type of comfort and stability. And so we're going to see Jake Barnes turn to friends, sports, and nature to help overcome some of his trauma. We examined last time the ideas of the lost generation and how Hemingway is part of this lost generation, experiencing World War I firsthand and then writing about it. And so I want you to think about how we see these themes embedded within, excuse me, the Sun Also Rises. Another true element of Hemingway's style, true to his style, is that we see an abandoned narrator, meaning that the narrator isn't really going to comment on the action. We're just going to the narrator's just going to tell us the who, the what, the where, and the when, right? So it's just as though it's a reporter objectively kind of commenting on the action. So it's that objective narrator rather than a subjective narrator telling us what to think, what to feel, how to react to certain events in the story. And so we're going to see that abandoned narrator or an objective narrator just telling us the facts and then leaving it up to us, the reader, to make meaning out of those facts, or to determine which facts are the most important, or how do we connect them together, what are the main ideas, how are we to feel about the particular characters in the story. You're generally going to see simple language within a Hemingway story. It's going to be very short sentences, very short, precise sentences. You're going to see sentences that are free from adjectives and adverbs, right? You're not going to see that Jake Barnes did something well, right? That has a way of tends to sway the reader into some authorial bias, and Hemingway's trying to remove himself as much as possible from the story to just let us interact with these events. And so it's almost as though he's a reporter, just giving you the facts, and then we have to make meaning out of those facts. And actually, Hemingway started his career as a writer, working for the Kansas City Star, learning how to do this, right? We're learning how to report on facts and only the facts. And then there's also this idea out there which is true to Hemingway style, what is known as the theory of omission or an iceberg theory. And so what that means is Hemingway is not going to tell us every nitty-gritty detail. He's going to give us some of the main ideas, but then the main theories, the thoughts, the ideas, the meaning, the significance is all going to be part of that 7/8 part of the iceberg that's below the surface. And so he requires more of us to pay attention, to find meaning, and to follow the action rather than doing that for us. He writes The Sun Also Rises in 1926 after he has been injured in the war. He's returned to the United States. He felt the United States was just too suffocating for him, and so he wants to get back to Europe. Initially, he was going to go to Rome, but then his friend, another writer, Sherwood Anderson, tells him to go to Paris. This is the cultural center of the world, and so this is where you want to go if you really want to understand the modern world, modern art, become a modern writer. You're going to have to go to Paris. And so he writes Hemingway a letter of introduction to Gertrude Stein, who is an avant-garde writer that's in Paris. And she introduces him to a world of art. She introduces him to Picasso. She introduces him to James Joyce, other writers that are out there, T.S. Eliot. And so he becomes immersed within this Parisian culture. And then he, on one particular trip, he goes to Spain, is inspired by the bullfights in Pamplona. And he actually puts the bullfights on the map. Before this, the bullfights really weren't that big of a deal. But after he writes The Sun Also Rises in 1926, every able-bodied man, woman, and child wanted to go to Spain to run with the bulls. And there's something about this story that really resonated with the post-World War I audience that it hit. And this was an immediate sensation. And part of it perhaps gets to, this is one of the epigraphs that begin The Sun Also Rises, that it's a quote from Ecclesiastes. One generation passeth away, another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. And so what we see with these people who are coming out of the war, they're shell-shocked, we talked about the collective trauma, they're looking for continuity. And so what we see within the characters of The Sun Also Rises is that they too are shell-shocked. They do have this collective trauma, and they're looking for something. They're searching for continuity. So I want you to look for that. How do they search for continuity? What do they turn to as a source of comfort within the novel? And each character turns to something a little bit different. And so I want you to think about that. But that idea that the generations come and go, but the earth is still going to be there. The sun also riseth, and that's where the title comes from. And the sun goeth down, and hasteth to the place where it arose. The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about unto the north. And it whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to its circuits. All the rivers run to the seas, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. And so we see a lot of ideas from Gauguin that we've talked about before. This idea of the modern world seems to be corrupt. It's led us to massive death, 20 million people dying during the 4-year war, and then countless others dying as a result of the 1918 influenza, the Spanish flu. So you have this massive gap within society, and people are wondering, where do we turn to? Where do we go now? And so they're seeking to find some type of continuity, that they're not just at the end of human existence. They're looking for something to piece together their shattered lives. And so The Sun Also Rises speaks to that, becomes a voice for that generation who's feels as though they're adrift, feels as though they're looking for greater meaning, when all of the religious and political institutions that promised that they would have greater meaning if they went to war, and they would have parades, and it all makes sense, and they'd all be heroes. And after the war, it didn't make any sense, and nobody was a hero. And so they're trying to understand, where do we go from here? I wanted to start with this clip from Rick Steves. I've showed you a couple of clips from him. He travels throughout Europe, giving us interesting insights into different tourist destinations. And he had a a segment on Pamplona, and I just want to show you a couple of minutes from this because it really helps to contextualize what's happening within the San Fermin Festival in Pamplona, which is what Hemingway goes to, is inspired by, and what Jake Barnes goes to, and he becomes inspired by.
As if he were a native son.
That's a statue of Hemingway.
First came here for the 1923 running of the bulls. Inspired by the spectacle, he later wrote his bullfighting classic, The Sun Also Rises. He said he enjoyed seeing two wild animals running together, one on two legs and the other on four. Hemingway put Pamplona on the world map. When he first visited, it was a dusty town of 30,000 with an obscure bullfighting festival. Now, 1 million people a year come here for one of the world's great parties. After dark, the town erupts into a rollicking party scene. While the craziness rages day and night, the city's well organized, and even with all the alcohol, it feels in control and things go smoothly. Amazingly, in just a few hours, this same street will host a very different spectacle. The running of the bulls takes place early each morning. Spectators claim a vantage point along the barrier at the crack of dawn. Early in the morning? Nope, for many of these revelers, it's still late at night. The anticipation itself is thrilling. Security crews sweep those not running out of the way. Shop windows and doors are boarded up. Fencing is set up to keep the bulls on course and protect the crowd. The runners are called mozos. While many are just finishing up a night of drinking, others train for the event. They take the ritual seriously and run every year. At 8 o'clock, a rocket is fired and the mozos take off. Moments later, a second rocket means the bulls have been released. They stampede half a mile through the town, from their pens to the bullfighting arena. At full gallop, it goes by fast. Bulls thunder through the entire route in just 2.5 minutes. The mozos try to run in front of the bulls for as long as possible, usually just a few seconds, before diving out of the way. They say on a good run, you feel the breath of the bull on the back of your legs.
On a bad one, you feel the horn at your butt.
Cruel as this all seems for the bulls, who scramble for footing on the cobblestones as they rush toward their doom in the bull ring, the human participants don't come out unscathed. Each year, dozens of people are gored or trampled. Over the last century, 15 mozos have been killed at the event. After it's done, people gather for breakfast and review the highlights on TV. All day long, local channels replay that morning's spectacle. The finale of the event each day is in the evening when crowds fill the bull ring. Pamplona's arena, the third biggest in the world after Madrid and Mexico City, is sold out each day of the festival. One by one, the bulls that ran that morning explode out of the gate to meet their matador. First, the picadors. Then, the banderillos. And finally, the matador in his sparkling suit of light. While cruel brutality to many, others still consider bullfighting an art form. It's hard for me to appreciate, but to the Spaniards who pack this arena, there's a nobility to the beast and an elegance to the fight.
Okay, I want to leave off with that, but I want you to think about why Hemingway is choosing Paris and Pamplona as the setting for this particular story, right? So thinking about that, the theory of omission, or the iceberg theory, right? Hemingway chooses his words carefully. He chooses his location carefully because they all have greater meaning and significance. So I want you to think about, what is it about this that helps the characters to find continuity and stability? Or what is it about Paris that represents the modern world to the characters, right? Some of the major themes what you're going to see is the war is going to be one of the major themes. And again, part of that underwater part of the story, right, that underwater iceberg that we see within this is the war is never explicitly shown within the story, right? The story takes place after the war, right, in the mid-20s. And so there's really no war, only the lingering effects of the war. And so the war is there, even though we don't see any battle scenes, right? The characters are still grappling with it. So I want you to think about how do we see the residual elements of war, even though there's no specific overt description of it. We also see one of the major themes is the modern woman that emerges onto the scene. In the 1920s, we see a new type of woman that is independent, one that is free from her domesticity, so to say, someone that's not afraid to drink or smoke in public, doesn't really think anything about having to have your dress all the way down to your ankle, which that was a Victorian standard, but we see women now wearing much shorter dresses. We see them becoming much more assertive with men. And so we see a different image of woman being represented. I want you to think about that and how do we see that within this particular story. Because Hemingway represents this with Brett Ashley. And so I want you to think of how does Brett Ashley how is she represented, and how do you feel about this representation? We see the failures of the modern world. The modern and urban world has failed the characters in one way or another. I want you to think about how we see that. And then a search for continuity through tradition. And how do we see that search for continuity? Some traditions prove to fail the characters, and some traditions, they're looking for sustenance and stability. And then I want you to think about how do we see the fragmentations of characters? How are each of the characters completely decimated in one way or another? Emotionally, psychologically, intellectually. How are they all fragments, right? Just kind of pieces of what they used to be. How has the modern world changed them? And I think a good way to think about this is the first chapter is Robert Cohn. And I want you to think about how Robert Cohn is harmed by his environment, right? He seems to be, this decent boxer at Princeton. He seems to be pretty intellectual and engaged. And then he experiences racism as a Jewish person. And that's going to change him. It's going to harden him. It's going to cause emotional trauma for him. And so as we think about the fragmentation of characters, how do we see each character dealing with some type of trauma? A couple other questions that I want you to think about as we go through. And then I want to read through some quotes just to contextualize some of this. Why do you think that Hemingway began the novel with Robert Cohn instead of the protagonist and narrator Jake Barnes, right? So why is it done through Robert Cohn? Why does he start there? Rather than, you'd think you'd start with Jake Barnes, right? So how does Robert Cohn's story help to provide a framework or a basis for understanding the rest of the events? And do you think that Robert Cohn is a sympathetic or just pathetic character, right? How do you feel about him? And how do you think Hemingway wants us to feel about him? In what ways does Hemingway question the credibility of Jake Barnes as the narrator? Can we trust Jake in his assumptions and conclusions? Why or why not? One way to think about this is in chapter 1. Jake thinks that, well, first of all, he's like, I don't really know if Robert Cohn was even a boxer, right? And then he finds out later that not only was Robert Cohn a boxer, right? He goes to Spider Kelly and asks him, but he actually was a pretty good boxer, right? And then Jake Barnes hears about Robert Cohn's new book. And Jake says, it wasn't really that great. But on the other side, critics acclaim this book. They actually think that Robert Cohn's book is actually pretty successful. And so Jake Barnes makes some false assumptions even in that those first and second chapters. And want you to think about, how does that show that he has his own biases? And the idea that Hemingway introduces used to be, as you would read a book, you could trust the narrator. The narrator's going to be unbiased. You can trust, in the Jane Austen novel, you can trust the character that's telling the story because the narrator isn't wrong. It almost has this kind of God's eye view of the events. Well, Hemingway says that, well, each of us, if we were each telling a story, we're all going to have our own biases. And so he reveals those biases. He shows that Jake does make some false assumptions. He is fallible just like any of us. And so in that sense, Jake Barnes is that modern hero, just kind of telling us the story just like it is according to his perspective. But we have to realize that it is only according to his perspective. How do the characters struggle to cope in a world shattered by war and seemingly void of values and ideals, and where do they go for comfort? And one of the things that I generally get as I ask students to read this is, man, there's a lot of drinking in this particular book. They just seem that that's all they do. And in some ways, yes, that's true, but I want you to think about what purpose does the alcohol have within the story, right? And what are the characters doing as they turn to alcohol, and how does that perhaps reveal some deeper psychological trauma that the characters are faced with? Let's take a look at some elements that I want to just point out to you. One is the representation of the modern world that we see within Paris. And we've seen this representation with Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, and as you see at the bottom, Kirchner was a German expressionist, and he's also painting about the modern urban world, although this particular image is of the streets of Berlin, and Hemingway's writing about Paris. But the same kind of context, the same kind of idea of understanding the modern world. And this is Jake. He says, I sat at the table on a terrace of the Neapolitan after Robert had gone, watching it get dark, the electric signs come on, and the red and green stop and go traffic signal, and the crowd going by, and the horse cabs clippity-clopping along the edge of the solid traffic, and the pools, which are ladies of the night, going by, singing and in pairs, looking for their evening meal. And we've seen some images of this, about how the modern world is affecting women. And we see that within Kirchner's street in Berlin. We see these women who are ladies of the night that are walking the streets, looking for their quote-unquote evening meal. But we also see the busyness, right? This constant, this hurry and rush of the modern world. That's all part of this kind of context. And so Jake decides to pick up one of these ladies of the night just to have dinner, because he doesn't really want to have it alone. I want to think about his interaction with her. Well, what do you drink? I asked, right? So Jake, and then he asked the Georgette, who is the lady of the night that he picks up. Pernod. It's not good for little girls. Little girl yourself. Dites garçon un Pernod, right? So she calls to the waiter. I want this drink. Et Pernod for me too. What's the matter? She asks. Going on a party? Sure, aren't you? I don't know. You never know in this town. Don't you like Paris? No. Why don't you go somewhere else? Isn't anywhere else. You're happy, all right. Happy, I'll fit angel it, heck. Pernod is a greenish imitation absinthe, and we've talked about that before with the Impressionists, right? The absinthe drinker with Manet. When you add water, it turns milky. It tastes like licorice, and it has a good uplift, but it drops you just as far. We sat and drank, and the girl looked sullen. Well, I said, are you going to buy me dinner? Right? And so as we think about this, right, as the characters turn to alcohol, what's the purpose of this, right? Is this just, some type of frat kind of thing, or just kind of needless hedonism? Or are they seeking to escape, right? My arm around her. She looked up to be kissed. She touched me with one hand, and I put her hand away, right? So she's kind of initiating some type of romantic encounter here, but he says, never mind. She asks, what's the matter? You sick? He says, yes, right? So that idea, there's some underwater part of the iceberg. Yes, he's sick, but it's not as though he has influenza. He has something else, right? And she says, yes, everybody's sick. I'm sick too. And there's some meaning here, right? The sickness could be the sickness of just living in the milieu of post-war Europe. But it could be the sickness is, for her, an occupational hazard, would be an STD. But for him, it means something else. This is referring to a war wound. Jake Barnes was a pilot during World War I. And rather than, the idea of the war bringing this heroism, this patriotism, this honor, this masculinity, go find yourself, be rough and tough, it actually strips him of his manhood. It emasculates him. As a pilot in World War One, you generally fly. The planes at the time were really low; they didn't fly very high, and generally they're either made from a very thin canvas or a very thin wood to make them light so they can fly. And so they were very thin. And if you're flying pretty low and not very fast, and you have not very much protection, as you're flying overhead, it makes it easy for someone down the enemy side to shoot up above. And as you're in the cockpit, there is a particular part that is susceptible, shall we say. And so where it counted, or he was shot where it counted, and he has been wounded as a result. And so this is going to be something, rather than war providing some type of bravery, courage, honor, patriotism, it actually emasculates him, and he's going to have to live with that as for the rest of his life. And then it refers to this again, just part of the underwater, part of the iceberg. And this is when Jake and Mike are talking, and Jake kind of just is kidding around with them as they're on their fishing trip. You're an expatriate. You've lost touch with the soil. You get precious. Fake European standards have ruined you. So he's just giving Jake a hard time about becoming too much of an expatriate, too much of a Parisian. You drink yourself to death. You become obsessed with sex. But you spend all your time talking, not working. You're an expatriate, see. You hang around cafes. It sounds like a swell life, I said. When do I work? You don't work. One group claims women support you. Another group claims you're impotent, right? So there's kind of this undercut here. No, I just had an accident. Again, that's a reference to his war wound, but it wasn't really an accident. It was a wound, right? Never mention that, Bill said. The sort of thing that can't be spoken of. That's what you got to work up into a mystery, like Henry's bicycle. And according to the legend, Henry James jumped on a bicycle without a seat, and it physically hurt him in the same place, so to speak. He had been going splendidly, but he stopped. I was afraid he thought he had hurt me with a crack about being impotent. I waited to start him again. It wasn't a bicycle, I said. He was riding horseback. I heard it was a tricycle. Well, I said, a plane is a sort of like a tricycle. The joystick works the same. And so that's the indication that Jake was a pilot during the war. And the 1920s audience would have picked up on the fact that, the reference to impotence, the reference to being a pilot, the reference to his injury, this is all, that kind of injury was very common for pilots coming out of World War I. And I want you to think about how that affects Jake and his relationships, right? As he's fragmented by the war. As he's in the cab with Brett at the beginning of the novel in chapter 4, she says, "Don't touch me. Please don't touch me. What's the matter? I can't stand it." "Oh, Brett, you mustn't. You must know I can't stand it. That's all. Oh, darling, please understand." Jake says, "Don't you love me?" "Love you? I simply turn all to jelly when you touch me. Isn't there anything you can do about it?" She was sitting up now. My arm was around her, and she was leaning back against me. We were quite calm. She was looking into my eyes with the way she looked that made you wonder whether she really saw out of her own eyes. They had a look on. They would look on and on after everyone else's eyes in the world would have stopped looking. She looked as though there was nothing on earth she would not look at like that. And really, she was afraid of so many things. And so you see this connection that both of them want to have this relationship, want it to work out, but there's obviously something that is going to stop it, right? Brett is fractured by her own trauma, and Jake has his own emotional and now physical trauma that he is suffering with. She had been looking into my eyes all the time. Her eyes had different depths. Sometimes they seem perfectly flat. Now you can see all the way through them. And I think that's an interesting way of describing people. That the idea of, when you can actually see in through someone allows you into their life, into their kind of deeper thoughts and emotions, you can see all the way into them. Or when they've just put up a wall, put up a barrier, and there's nothing else that you can actually see or get out of them. Well, I think of all the heck I've put chaps through, I'm paying for it all now, right? So Brett's kind of remorseful of how she treats men. Why do you think about Brett as maybe kind of this multi-dimensional character rather than just someone that goes out and destroys people? Don't talk like a fool, I said. Besides, what happened to me is supposed to be funny. I never think about it, right? So it's kind of an interesting thought as he refers to his wound here. Oh no, I lay you don't. Well, let's shut up about it. I laughed about it once myself. I laughed about it too myself once. She was looking at me. A friend of my brother's came home that way from Mons. It seemed like a heck of a joke. Chaps never know anything, do they? And so here he refers to the fact that, I kind of laugh it off. But again, this is part of the poise of a Hemingway hero. It's funny, I said. It's very funny. And it's a lot of fun, too, to be in love. Don't you think? Do you think so? Her eyes looked flat again. So now Brett is kind of putting up that wall. She's kind of distancing herself from Jake. So we get to see, for a moment, we get to see who she really is. And now she kind of puts on this front again as she kind of protects herself against further pain. I don't mean fun in that way. In a way that it's an enjoyable feeling. No, she said, I think it's heck on earth. It's good to see each other. No, I don't think it is. Don't you want to? I have to, right? So again, there's this idea that there's this force that's kind of pulling them together. But again, there's this idea that there's something pushing them apart, right? The modern world has kind of caused this kind of fragmentation between them. We were sitting now like two strangers. At first, they were kind of cuddled up against each other, and now they were two strangers on their way to a restaurant. And then I wanted to turn to this particular quote in chapter 4. This is where we see a stream of consciousness within Jake. And I want you to think about where do his thoughts continually go, right? And here we just see who he truly is. And we see a little bit of his front, right, as he says that I don't think about the wound, I joke about it, right? Now we get to see how he actually feels about it. This is going to be different from the kind of persona that he shows to the world. There was a light in the concierge's room, and I knocked on the door, and she gave me my mail. I wished her good night and went upstairs. There were 2 letters and some papers. I looked at them under the gaslight in the dining room. The letters were from the States. One was a bank statement. It showed a balance of $2,432.60. I got out my checkbook and deducted 4 checks drawn since the first of the month and discovered that I had a balance of $1,832.60. I wrote this on the back of the statement. The other letter was a wedding announcement. Mr. and Mrs. Aloysius Kirby announced the marriage of their daughter, Catherine. I knew neither the girl nor the man she was marrying. They must be circularizing the town. It was a funny name. I felt sure I could remember anyone with a name like Aloysius. It was a good Catholic name. There was a crest on the announcement, like Zizi, the Greek duke, and that count. That count was funny. Brett had a title too, Lady Ashley. To heck with Brett. To heck with you, Lady Ashley. Where do his thoughts go, right? He gets a wedding announcement, starts thinking about the wedding, starts thinking about people, and his thoughts turn to Brett, right? But again, this is going to be complicated because of the wound, right? The fragmentation of the wound. I lit a lamp beside the bed, turned off the gas, and opened the wide windows. The bed was far back from the windows, and I sat with the windows open and undressed by the bed. Outside, a night tram running on the streetcar tracks went by carrying vegetables to the market. They were noisy at night when you could not sleep. Undressing, I looked at myself in the mirror of the big armoire beside the bed, right? So now again, he's kind of standing there thinking about his wound. What do his thoughts kind of return to? And that was a typically French way to furnish a room. Practical too, I suppose. Of all the ways to be wounded. I suppose it was funny. I put on my pajamas and got into bed. I had the 2 bullfight papers. I took their wrappers off. One was orange, the other yellow. They would both have the same news, so whichever I read first would spoil the other. L'Octorio was the better paper, so I started to read it. I read it all the way through, including the petite correspondence and the chronograms. I blew out the lamp. Perhaps I would be able to sleep. Right? So he's kind of been doing all this as a distraction. But again, where does his thoughts start turning to? My head started to work. The old grievance. Well, it was a rotten way to be wounded and flying on the joke of a front like the Italian. In the Italian hospital, we were going to form a society. It had a funny name in Italian. I wondered what become of the others, the Italians. That was all in the Ospedale Maggiore in Milano, Paglione Ponte. The next building was the Paglione Zonda. there was a statue of Aponte, or maybe it was Zonda. That was where the liaison colonel came to visit me. That was funny. That was about the first funny thing. I was all bandaged up, but they had told him about it. Then he made that wonderful speech. You, a foreigner, an Englishman, any foreigner was an Englishman, have given more than your life. What a speech. I would like to have it illuminated to hang it in the office. He never laughed. He was putting himself in my place, I guess. Che mala fortuna, che mala fortuna. What a bad misfortune. I lay awake thinking and my mind jumped around. Then I couldn't keep away from it. I started to think about Brett. And all the rest of it went away. I was thinking about Brett and my mind stopped jumping around and started in a sort of smooth waves. Then, all of a sudden, I started to cry. Then after a while it was better and I lay in bed and listened to the heavy trams go by way down the street, and then I went to sleep, right? So I want you to think about what does his thoughts turn to? Where do they keep going back to? And why, right? As we think about some of the frustrations, right? Some of the modern humanity dealing with the complexities of the war that has no type of meaning, no type of significance. He's given more, as the count says, or the officer says, given more than his life. Now he has to piece together his life, piece together what remains of his life, and he has to live with this day after day. And so this is going to be constantly on his thoughts, constantly in the back of his mind, even though he's not necessarily doing it actively during the day. He doesn't put that front on there for others to see. When he's at home and all of these thoughts come flooding to his mind, he becomes overwhelmed and he starts to cry, right? So it deeply affects him psychologically and emotionally. And I want to take a look at, in chapter 10, Jake is drawn into a cathedral on his way to Spain. He stops in Bayonne at a cathedral, and he's just kind of drawn into it. And I want to juxtapose this with the Cathedral of Spain to take a look at how he's kind of still struggling with religion, just trying to find himself. And I want to focus on his prayer. Again, we see some stream of consciousness with Jake as he goes into prayer. He says, "At the end of the street, I saw the cathedral and walked up toward it. I knelt and started to pray and prayed for everyone I thought of, Brett and Mike and Bill and Brett and Robert Cohn and myself and all the bullfighters separately for the ones I liked. I'm lumping all the rest. Then I prayed for myself again, and while I was praying for myself, I found I was getting sleepy." Right? So again, is this a meaningful prayer? So I prayed that the bullfights would be good and that it would be a fine fiesta and that we would get some fishing. I wondered if there was anything else I might pray for, and I thought I would like to have some money, so I prayed that I would make a lot of money, and then I started to think about how I would make it, and thinking about the money reminded me of the count, and I started to wonder where he was, right? So as we think about this, right, how does Jake respond to Catholicism? And why do you think this might be the case? And this is the cathedral as he's walking through Bayonne. This is the cathedral that he would have saw and was drawn to. And as he was in his prayer, he says, "As I was kneeling with my forehead on the wood in front of me and was thinking to myself as praying, I was a little ashamed and regretted that I was such a rotten Catholic. But I realized there was nothing that I could do about it, at least for a while. And maybe never. But anyway, it was a grand religion. I only wish I felt religious, and maybe I would next time." And so we see a little bit of Thomas Hardy's impercipient here, where he wants to have those feelings. But for some reason, I think it's because of the PTSD, the trauma that he's experiencing. It's blocking those kind of. And I want you to think about, as he watches the bullfights, what does Jake notice about the bullfighters? The bullfight on the second day was much better than the first. Brett sat between Mike and me at the Barrera, and Bill and Cohn went up above. Romero was the whole show. I did not think Brett saw any other bullfighter. No one else did either, except the hard-shell technicians. It was all Romero. There were two other matadors, but they did not count. So what is it about Romero what does he do differently? And what do people like about that? I told Brett about watching the bull, not the horse. When the bulls charged the picadors and got to watching the picks so that she saw what it was all about. So to become more something with unexplained horrors. I had her watch how Romero took the bull away from a fallen horse with his cape. and how he held him with the cape and turned him smoothly and suavely, never wasting the bull. She saw how Romero avoided every brusque movement and saved his bull for the last when he wanted him. Not winded and discomposed, but smoothly worn out. And so there's this idea of wearing the bull down, but there's a process to it, right? She saw how close Romero always worked the bull and pointed out to her tricks the other bullfighters used to make it look as though they were working closely. She saw why she liked Romero's cape work and why she did not like others. Romero never made any contortions. Always it was a straight and pure natural line. The others twisted themselves like corkscrews, their elbows raised and leaned against the flanks of the bull after his horns had passed to give a fake look of danger. Afterwards, all that was fake turned bad and gave an unpleasant feeling. Romero's bullfighting gave the real emotion because it kept the absolute purity of line in his movements, and it was always quietly and calmly let the horns pass him closely each other. He did not have to emphasize their closeness. Brett saw how something that was beautiful done close to the bulls was ridiculous if it were done a little way off. I told her how since the death of Joselito, all of the bullfighters had been developing a technique that simulated the appearance of danger in order to give a fake emotional feeling. While the bullfighter was really safe, Romero had the old thing, holding of his purity of line through the maximum exposure, while he dominated the bull by making him realize he was unattainable, while he prepared for the killing. And so what is it about Romero's technique? Why is it better than the other bullfighters, right? I want you to think about what is it, that idea of that fakeness, that falsity, right? That searching for truth and the purity of truth that really Jake clings to. And there's something else about bullfighting that I want you to think about. Pedro Romero had greatness. He loved bullfighting. I think he loved bulls. Everything he could control the locality he did all afternoon. What is Jake seeking, and what does Pedro Romero do? What's he able to accomplish, right? Everything he controlled the locality he did all afternoon. The bull's tail went up and he charged, and Romero moved his arm ahead of the bull, wheeling his feet firm. The dampened, muddened weighted cape swung open and full as sail fills. And Romero pivoted with it just ahead of the bulls. And the end of the pass, they were facing each other again. Romero smiled. The bull wanted it again, and Romero's cape filled again, this time on the other side. Each time he let the bull pass so close that the man and the bull and the cape that filled and pivoted ahead of the bull were all one sharply etched mass. It was all so controlled. Part of the bullfight, it celebrates life and death, right? This idea of continuity between life and death. It also symbolizes the idea that the world is out of control, right? The bull represents that chaos. But if you can turn to certain strategies, certain techniques, certain methodology, you can find a way to control elements of the uncontrollable. And so what he observes about Romero, the greatness that he has, is he's facing this hurdle, as Jake is facing the hurdle of his life each day. But he does so with grace, he does so with dignity, and he's able to control the aspects that he can control with poise and strength, right? And so that's really what Jake thinks. He can go back, right? And so as I want you to think about how he applies that new wisdom. We see Jake and Brett again, much like we see him at the beginning of the novel. The Hemingway juxtaposes this, right? He reintroduces the same scene, but it's now different, right? They're both in a taxi cab. We have Jake and Brett, but the interaction is different, right? Brett says, "Oh, Jake, we could have had such a good time together." And Jake says, "Yes. Isn't it pretty to think so?" Right? And I want you to think about how he's changed, right? In chapter 4, verses chapter 19, right? They're both in a taxi. They're both sitting close together. Jake, now in the first part, is desiring a relationship. Can't we just find a way to make it work? But in chapter 19, he's moved on, right? He's found something, right? He's found a way to make it work in a world that seems as though it's torn down. He's found some type of stability, found some type of strength. And I've just given you a couple examples to kind of think about, to work through. This isn't the only way to kind of read The Sun Also Rises, I want you to kind of find your own thoughts on how Jake finds continuity and stability in a world that seems as though it's chaotic and uncertain.